7 terrifying Home Alone stories that happened during snowstorms. Story number 1, by Amelia Trent. In January 2018, Boston was hit by one of the most brutal nor'easters in recent memory. The city was blanketed in snow, the streets deserted as people hunkered down to wait out the storm. I was alone in my brownstone apartment in Back Bay, the power knocked out by the high winds, and the only light came from the candles I'd lit around the living room. The silence was unnerving. Without the usual hum of the city, the howling wind outside seemed amplified, like it was alive, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. It was just after midnight when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic knocking at the front door. I froze, my heart pounding. Who would be out in this weather? I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole, but no one was there. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. It's just the wind, I told myself, retreating back to the couch. But a few minutes later, the knocking started again, louder this time. I grabbed my phone and crept back to the door, pressing my ear against it. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone was standing right there, waiting for me to open it. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. This time, I mustered the courage to open the door a crack. The freezing air rushed in, but the porch was empty. There were no footprints in the freshly fallen snow, just an unbroken expanse of white. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away, my hands trembling. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the unease was impossible to shake. I double-checked all the locks and turned on every flashlight I had, filling the room with as much light as possible. I was starting to calm down when the knocking came again, this time from the back door. My stomach dropped. The back door led to a small, fenced-in yard, completely enclosed by tall walls. There was no way anyone could have gotten back there without leaving tracks in the snow. I grabbed a kitchen knife and made my way to the kitchen, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Through the frosted glass of the back door, I could see a shadow moving on the other side. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The shadow didn't respond, didn't move. It just stood there, indistinct and menacing. Summoning all my courage, I yanked the door open, but the yard was empty. Just like the front porch, the snow was untouched, unbroken. The shadow was gone. I locked the door and spent the rest of the night in the living room, my back to the wall and my eyes on the doors. Every creak of the old building made me jump, and I barely slept. The next morning, as the storm began to ease, I told my neighbor about what had happened. Her face went pale. "You live in the Jenkins house, don't you?" she asked. When I nodded, she told me the story. In the late 1800s, the Jenkins family had lived there with their daughter Mary. During a blizzard, Mary had gone outside to play and never came back. Her parents searched for hours, but she was never found. They swore they heard her knocking on the door that night, my neighbor said. But when they opened it, no one was there. People say she still tries to come home during snowstorms. The thought sent chills down my spine. I moved out of that apartment a few months later, but I'll never forget that night. To this day, whenever I hear the wind rattling a door during a storm, I think of Mary Jenkins and wonder if she's still out there, knocking, waiting for someone to let her in. Story number 2, by Greg Matthews. In December 2020, a massive blizzard swept through Fargo, North Dakota, trapping me alone in my farmhouse on the outskirts of town. My family had moved out of state the year before, leaving me to care for the property. It was an old farmhouse, creaky and weathered, but I'd grown up there and knew every inch of the place. Or so I thought. That night, the storm was relentless. The wind howled against the windows, snow piled up higher than the porch steps, and the temperature dropped so low it felt like the walls couldn't keep the cold out. I had a fire roaring in the living room and was reading a book, trying to ignore the storm's fury. when I heard a loud thump from upstairs. At first, I dismissed it as snow or ice falling from the roof. The house had always made noises during storms, groaning beams, rattling windows. But this was different. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, and it wasn't long before I heard it again. A distinct, deliberate thump, followed by faint shuffling. I set my book down, heart pounding, and grabbed a flashlight. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no answer, just the sound of the wind battering the house. Taking a deep breath, I climbed the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath my feet. The hallway upstairs was dark and cold, far colder than the rest of the house. I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight as I stepped toward the guest bedroom, where the noise seemed to have come from. The door was slightly ajar, and I could feel the icy draft coming from inside. When I pushed the door open, my stomach dropped. The window, which I was certain I had closed and locked earlier that day, was wide open, snow blowing in and covering the floor. I hurried to close it, my hands trembling. That's when I noticed the footprints. Wet, human-sized footprints trailed from the window across the snow-dusted floor to the corner of the room, where they stopped abruptly. I shone my flashlight into the corner, half expecting to see someone crouched there, but it was empty. My breath caught in my throat as I backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me. I rushed back downstairs, locking every door and window in the house, though it felt futile. The fire seemed weaker, the shadows in the room stretching and twisting unnaturally. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time, they came from the kitchen. It sounded like faint footsteps, deliberate and slow, moving across the tiled floor. I stayed frozen in the living room, clutching the fireplace poker, too terrified to investigate. The sounds stopped after a few minutes, but the house felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The next morning, as the storm began to ease, I ventured into the kitchen to find something that made my blood run cold. A single wet footprint on the floor, leading toward the basement door. The door itself was locked, as it always was, but the sight of that lone footprint sent shivers down my spine. I told a friend about what had happened, expecting him to laugh or brush it off. Instead, his face grew serious. "You know the story about your house, right?" he asked. I didn't. He went on to explain that in the 1930s, a drifter had taken shelter in the farmhouse during a similar blizzard. The family living there at the time hadn't known he was in the house until they found him frozen to death in the attic weeks later. "Maybe he was looking for warmth," my friend said. "Or maybe he's still trying to find it." I haven't spent another winter alone in that house since. The storm may have passed, but the memory of those footsteps, the open window, and that single wet footprint in the kitchen stays with me. Snowstorms are isolating enough without the feeling that something, or someone, else is inside with you. Story number 3, by Emma Wallace. In January 2017, I agreed to house sit for a friend in Juneau, Alaska. The house was beautiful, perched on a hill overlooking the snowy forest, and it felt like the perfect winter getaway. My friend warned me about the isolation, especially during storms, but I wasn't worried. I'd spent plenty of time alone in remote places, and figured this would be no different. On the second night, a massive snowstorm rolled in, blanketing the house in white and cutting off all visibility. The wind howled against the windows, and the power flickered a few times before finally going out completely. I lit some candles and wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to enjoy the quiet. But as the storm raged outside, the silence inside the house began to feel oppressive. Every creak and groan of the old structure set my nerves on edge. It was around 10 p.m. when I noticed something odd. The motion-activated lights in the driveway kept turning on. At first, I thought it might be an animal, But when I looked out the window, the driveway was empty. No footprints, no movement, just the light flickering on and off every few minutes. I convinced myself it was a glitch and tried to ignore it, though a small knot of unease began to form in my stomach. Later that night, as I was reading in the living room, I heard a faint tapping on the window. My first thought was that it was a branch hitting the glass, but when I looked, there were no trees close enough to the house. I got up to investigate and saw something that made my blood run cold, a handprint in the frost on the outside of the window. It was small, like a child's, and perfectly clear, as if someone had just pressed their hand against the glass. I wiped the frost away with my sleeve, trying to convince myself it was just condensation. But as I stepped back, another handprint appeared, this time higher up. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there were no footprints in the snow outside, nothing to suggest anyone had been near the house. Panicking, I locked all the doors and windows and sat on the couch, clutching a flashlight. The tapping continued sporadically, moving from one window to another. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the kitchen window, but when I shone my flashlight outside, there was nothing there. Just the unbroken expanse of snow and the swirling storm. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I stepped outside to check the perimeter of the house. The snow was deep and untouched, with no sign of footprints or disturbances. I told myself I must have imagined the handprints, that the storm and isolation were playing tricks on my mind. But then I noticed something chilling, a set of small footprints leading from the forest to the edge of the driveway. They stopped abruptly, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. When my friend returned, I told her about what had happened. Her face grew pale as she listened. "That house has a history," she said quietly. She explained that in the early 1900s, a little girl named Lily had lived there with her family. During a brutal snowstorm, Lily wandered into the woods and was never found. Her parents searched for days, but all they ever discovered were footprints in the snow, leading to nowhere. "People say she comes back during storms," my friend said, "looking for her way home." I haven't been back to Juneau since. The memory of those handprints, the shadow outside the window, and the eerie silence of that storm still haunt me. Being alone in a house during a snowstorm is unsettling enough, but when the snow holds the echoes of the past, it becomes something far more terrifying. Story number 4. By Daniel Porter. In February 2019, I stayed alone at my childhood home in Syracuse, New York, while my parents were out of town. A major snowstorm had swept in, burying the streets under layers of snow and cutting power across the neighborhood. Without my parents there, the house felt emptier than I remembered, and the silence was unsettling. With only a few candles and a flashlight to keep the darkness at bay, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. I chalked it up to the storm, but deep down, I couldn't shake the unease creeping over me. The storm intensified as the night went on. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it, a faint but deliberate creaking noise coming from the roof. At first, I thought it might be snow or ice sliding off, but the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth across the roof. My stomach twisted as I realized this wasn't normal. I sat up, holding my breath as I listened. The sound moved, slow and heavy, from one side of the house to the other, directly above me. My heart raced, but I told myself it had to be an animal. "Probably just a raccoon," I whispered, though I knew it didn't sound like one. The steps were too slow, too purposeful. Summoning my courage, I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. I slipped on my boots and jacket and stepped outside into the freezing night. The wind cut through me like a blade, and the snow crunched loudly under my feet. Shining the flashlight toward the roof, I froze. There, in the freshly fallen snow, were footprints, They stretched across the roof in a straight line, from one edge to the other. My breath caught in my throat. There was no ladder, no way anyone could have gotten up there. As I stood there, staring, the creaking started again. The footsteps moved slowly across the roof, heading toward the edge closest to where I was standing. It felt as though whoever, or whatever, was up there was watching me. My flashlight beam wavered as I backed away, cold fear gripping my chest. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. Back in the living room, I sat by the window, trying to convince myself that it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But then, I heard another sound, a loud thump coming from the backyard. I didn't want to look, but my curiosity got the better of me. I peeked through the curtains and immediately wished I hadn't. There, in the snow, was a new set of footprints. They led from the roof to the middle of the yard, where they stopped abruptly. There were no trails leading away, no sign of where the person, or thing, had gone. The snow was untouched beyond that point, an unbroken expanse of white. My hands shook as I closed the curtains, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to believe. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like a threat. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed of footsteps circling the house, always just out of sight. When morning finally came, the storm had eased, and the world outside was eerily calm. I stepped outside to check the footprints again, hoping they'd somehow disappeared. But they were still there, perfectly preserved, leading from the roof to the yard and stopping in that impossible way. When my parents returned a few days later, I told them what had happened. My dad laughed it off, saying it was probably just the storm messing with my imagination. But my mum's reaction was different. Her face grew serious, and she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "This isn't the first time someone's heard footsteps on the roof," she said quietly. She went on to tell me about the house's history. Decades before we moved in, the house had belonged to a family whose teenage son went missing during a snowstorm. He'd climbed onto the roof to clear snow and was never seen again. Search parties scoured the area, but all they found were his footprints, leading across the roof and stopping abruptly at the edge. "Some people say he never left," my mum said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hearing her story sent chills down my spine. I've always been skeptical of ghost stories, but that night changed me. The footprints, the creaking, and the feeling of being watched were all too real. I haven't stayed alone in that house since, and I don't plan to. Some places hold on to their past, and whatever happened on that roof all those years ago, it's clear that it left something behind. Story number 5, by Nathaniel Walsh. In December 2021, I was staying alone at my family's cabin just outside Grand Marais, Minnesota. The cabin had been in my family for generations, nestled on the edge of a dense forest that stretched for miles. During the summer, it was a peaceful retreat, but in the dead of winter, it became something else entirely, isolated, cold, and eerie. I'd come up to spend a quiet week away from the city, but when a massive blizzard swept in, I found myself snowed in and alone, with no way to leave. The storm began early in the afternoon, and by nightfall, the snow was coming down so heavily I couldn't see the tree line just a few yards from the cabin. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and making the old wooden cabin creak. I lit a fire in the stone fireplace and settled in with a book, trying to ignore the unease that had crept over me since the storm started. It was around 9 p.m. when I first heard it, a faint scratching at the front door. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch brushing against the wood, but when I got up to check, I realized there were no branches near the door. My heart began to race. I hesitated, then opened the door slightly, but there was nothing there, just the swirling snow and the bitter cold. I stepped onto the porch and shone my flashlight around. The snow was pristine, untouched, with no footprints in sight. I told myself it must have been the wind, though the sound hadn't quite matched. I locked the door and went back to my book, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But about an hour later, the scratching came again, louder this time and more insistent. My stomach dropped. Grabbing the fireplace poker for reassurance, I approached the door, listening intently. The scratching stopped as soon as I got close. Summoning all my courage, I threw the door open and stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at my face. The snow was falling even harder now, but the ground was still undisturbed. No tracks, no sign of anyone or anything that could have caused the noise. I stood there for a moment, my breath fogging in the air, before retreating inside and locking the door again. Not long after, I heard footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from upstairs. My stomach churned as I realized the only room above me was the attic. The cabin's attic was little more than a storage space, and I hadn't been up there in years. My family rarely used it, and I knew it should have been empty. I climbed the stairs slowly, flashlight in one hand and the poker in the other. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt colder here, almost icy. I opened the door and shone the flashlight inside. The space was empty, filled only with old furniture and a few boxes covered in dust. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The window was wide open, snow blowing in and covering the floor. I rushed to close the window, my hands trembling. As I did, I saw them. Footprints. Wet, human-sized footprints in the snow-covered attic floor, leading from the window to the far corner of the room. My flashlight flickered as I backed away, unable to bring myself to look at the corner. I slammed the attic door shut and ran back downstairs, locking myself in the living room. The storm raged on outside, but the cabin felt even colder than before, as though the fire wasn't doing anything to warm the space. Every creak of the old building made me jump, and I spent the rest of the night curled up by the fire, too afraid to close my eyes. When morning finally came, the storm had eased, and sunlight was breaking through the clouds. I stepped outside to check the perimeter of the cabin, hoping to find some logical explanation for what had happened. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading from the front porch around the side of the cabin and stopping directly below the attic window. The tracks were fresh and deep, but like the ones inside the attic, they stopped abruptly. There were no trails leading away from the cabin, no indication of where whoever or whatever had made them had gone. I called my uncle later that day, hoping he'd have an explanation. He listened quietly, then sighed. "You know the story about the cabin, don't you?" he asked. I didn't. He went on to tell me about a man who had lived there in the 1940s. During a brutal snowstorm, he'd gone out to gather firewood, but never came back. His body was found weeks later, frozen just a few yards from the house. "They say his spirit never left," my uncle said. "Some people think he's still looking for a way back inside." I haven't returned to the cabin since. The memory of those footsteps, the open attic window, and the tracks in the snow still haunts me. The storm may have passed, but the feeling of being watched hasn't. Some places aren't meant to be lived in, and that cabin in the woods is one of them. Story number 6. By Olivia Green. In February 2020, my aunt asked me to house sit for her in Casper, Wyoming. She was heading out of town for a few days, and with a snowstorm in the forecast, she needed someone to keep an eye on her old farmhouse. It was one of those classic, creaky homes with worn wooden floors, drafty windows, and a long history that seemed to hang in the air. She warned me that the house could feel especially lonely during storms, but I shrugged it off. A few days of quiet sounded perfect to me. I didn't know then just how wrong I was. The storm hit harder than expected on my first night there. By early evening, the snow was falling so heavily that the fields surrounding the house disappeared into a white void. The wind howled, battering the windows and causing the old house to groan as if it were alive. I lit a fire in the living room and settled in with a book, trying to ignore the eerie creaks and moans echoing through the empty house. Around 9 p.m., the storm knocked out the power, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a few candles and sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting long dancing shadows on the walls. It was then I noticed something strange. The air felt colder, even with the fire roaring. I chalked it up to the old windows and tried to focus on my book. The first noise came about an hour later, soft, deliberate footsteps, moving across the second floor. My heart stopped. I knew no one else was supposed to be there. At first, I told myself it was just the wind or the house settling, but the sound was too rhythmic, too human. It started in one room and slowly moved to another, pausing every few steps as if someone were listening. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The words felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth, but I had to say something. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the stairs, each creak of the wood under my feet adding to my anxiety. When I reached the hallway, the air was icy, far colder than downstairs. I could see my breath fogging in the flashlight's beam as I walked toward the guest bedroom, where the sound had seemed to end. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, snow blowing in and forming a thin layer on the hardwood floor. I hurried to close the window, my hands trembling as I locked it shut. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Wet, human-sized footprints leading from the window to the middle of the room. They stopped abruptly, as if whoever had made them had vanished. My stomach churned as I backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me. I rushed downstairs, locking every door and window I could find. I tried to convince myself that the footprints were my imagination, or maybe even old water stains, but deep down, I knew better. The house felt different now, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. I sat by the fire, gripping the flashlight, every creak and groan of the house making me jump. The night stretched on, and the storm outside only grew worse. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time on the stairs. They were faint at first, but grew louder and more deliberate. I froze, staring at the doorway to the living room, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The steps stopped just outside the room. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sound, but all I felt was the oppressive silence pressing down on me. Summoning all my courage, I turned the flashlight toward the doorway. The beam illuminated nothing but empty space, but the air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Then, out of nowhere, I felt it, a cold breeze brushing the back of my neck, as if someone was standing directly behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The fire flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that made the room feel alive. I didn't sleep at all that night. The footsteps came and went, sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to make me clutch the fireplace poker I'd grabbed for protection. The storm continued to rage outside, and the wind seemed to howl in harmony with the sounds inside the house. When dawn finally broke, I felt a rush of relief as the first rays of light filtered through the frost-covered windows. The next morning, I ventured upstairs again, hoping to convince myself that what I'd seen and heard was just my imagination. But when I opened the guest bedroom door, the footprints were gone. The floor was spotless, as if nothing had ever been there. Still, the air in the room felt colder than the rest of the house, and I quickly backed out, shutting the door behind me. When my aunt returned, I hesitated to tell her about what had happened, worried she'd think I was losing my mind. But when I finally did, her reaction surprised me. She sighed deeply and said, "I didn't want to tell you before, to scare you. But you're not the first person to hear footsteps in this house." She explained that decades ago, during a blizzard, A young woman who lived in the area had gone missing. She was last seen walking toward the house, hoping to find shelter, but she never made it. Her body was never found, though some say she still roams the property during storms, searching for warmth. I've heard her too, my aunt admitted quietly. She doesn't mean any harm. She's just lost. Hearing that sent chills down my spine. I haven't been back to that house since. The memory of those footsteps, the open window, and the cold presence behind me lingers in my mind. Some places carry the weight of the past, and during that storm, I felt it pressing down on me, more real than I ever thought possible. Story number 7. By James Harper. In January 2019, I was living in a small rental house on the outskirts of Portland, Maine. It wasn't anything special, just a modest 2-bedroom place with creaky floors and drafty windows. I'd moved there for work a few months earlier and was still getting used to being on my own. When a snowstorm rolled in, I thought it would be a quiet night to stay inside and relax. What I didn't realize was how terrifying a storm could become when you're all alone. The snow started falling early in the evening, blanketing the yard and the nearby woods in thick, white silence. By the time night fell, the storm had grown stronger, and the wind howled against the house like a living thing. I lit a few candles in case the power went out and settled on the couch with a blanket, the sound of the storm outside my only company. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard the first noise. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling something loose, but then I realized it was coming from the basement, a loud, distinct bang, like something heavy had been dropped. My heart skipped a beat. The basement door was locked, and I didn't have the key. The landlord had mentioned that it was used for storage, and I hadn't given it much thought until now. I stood there, staring at the door, my ears straining to hear any other sounds. The house creaked and groaned under the weight of the storm, but nothing else came from the basement. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and told myself it was just the storm causing things to shift down there. But then, about an hour later, I heard it again. A loud thud, followed by a faint scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My stomach turned. This time, the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving around directly beneath me. I grabbed a flashlight and stood in front of the basement door, unsure of what to do. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The scraping stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I turned the knob, but the door was still locked. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Faintly, I thought I heard breathing, slow, shallow, and unnervingly steady. I backed away from the door, my heart racing, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with a kitchen knife in my lap. The sounds from the basement came and went, soft thuds, the occasional scrape, and once, what I could have sworn was a low whisper. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, the storm had eased, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. I decided to call my landlord and ask him to check the basement. When he arrived, I explained what had happened, half expecting him to laugh it off. Instead, his expression grew serious. "That's odd," he said. "No one's been down there for years." He unlocked the door and swung it open. The basement was cold and dark, with a damp smell that made my stomach churn. We descended the stairs slowly, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. At first, everything seemed normal, just old furniture and boxes covered in dust. But then we noticed it, a trail of footprints in the thick layer of dust on the floor. The footprints were small, like those of a child, and they led from the far corner of the basement to the bottom of the stairs, where they stopped. Neither of us said a word. The landlord scanned the room with his flashlight, but there was no one there. No sign of how those footprints had gotten there, or where they could have gone. "This house has been here a long time," he said finally, his voice low. "You're not the first tenant to mention strange things." I pressed him for more details, and he reluctantly told me about a family who had lived there in the 1960s. Their young daughter, Lily, had gone missing during a snowstorm. Search parties scoured the area for days, but she was never found. "Some people say she got lost in the woods," the landlord said. "Others think she never left the house." Hearing that sent chills down my spine. I moved out of that house a few weeks later, unable to shake the memory of those footprints and the whispers in the basement. To this day, I avoid basements during storms, and every time I hear a faint noise in the middle of the night, I remember that house in Portland. Whatever was down there that night wasn't just my imagination, and some things are better left locked away. And that wraps up 7 terrifying Home Alone stories that happened during snowstorms. These chilling true accounts remind us that snowstorms don't just bring cold, they can awaken things we'd rather not face. From phantom footprints to whispers in the dark, the isolation of being alone during a storm can reveal the unexplainable. Which story sent shivers down your spine the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more tales of the eerie and unexplained. Until next time, stay warm, stay safe, and keep the lights on. You never know what might be out there.